About 4.5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, before we were the pastors here, we'd been coming to this church now 5.5 years. And when we started here, we went into the COVID season. And when services started to return, I got a phone call from one of the leaders here who said, would you be open to preaching with the church? And I said, sure. And they said, the only challenge is you've got to do it twice. You can do it in person, but we also have to come and we've got to film you do it a second time for our online congregation. And I was like, because I was like, can I do the editing? Because that way I could slice out all the bits that I didn't want in it, but they didn't give me the editing rights, so it was what it was. And so I apologize for that. I apologize that it was not as good as I wanted it to be. But strangely, that sermon one line from the sermon ended up being something that people kept coming back and saying to me. And I remember when I was preparing it, I was saying, God, I'm new to this community. What do you want to say? What are you stirring in my heart? And this phrase kept coming to my mind, and it's this phrase that we'll put up on the screen. It's thank God you're here. Two of you may remember when I actually shared this message. I'm one of them and one other person here who actually remembers. The idea came from the television series that has actually made a comeback since I did this sermon. True story. When I first did it, I was talking about this television series where there's a bunch of comedians, they rock up onto a set, and there's a room, and they have to walk through a door, and they don't know what's on the other side of the door. And as they walk through the door, they're greeted with the phrase, thank God you're here. And all of a sudden, they have to immediately act and respond in that context to what's happening. And it's a very funny show, and some of these comedians are absolutely brilliant, and these actors, how they engage in that environment. And I used to love the show. And then I shared the message, and then apparently the rate, like the people looking it up went through the roof, so much so that the producers got back together and said, listen, I don't know what's going on, but something in Southeast Queensland, there's a real hub of interest around our show, and so we should bring it back. So they brought it back. That could be a lie, but let's just go with it because it feels good to make stories up sometimes, doesn't it? And so the concept I always found really compelling and challenging, because when I thought about it in relationship to our lives and the kind of people that God is calling us to be, I was thinking, what would it be like if we were a thank God you're here person? Every single day, we walk metaphorically through doors into situations and circumstances, some of which are really familiar to us, and some of which we're not prepared for. And when we walk through the door tomorrow, this afternoon, tonight, the question is, would someone on the other side look at us and say, oh, thank God you're here? Unfortunately, the history of the church there has been times when the church has been a thank God you're here people, and there are times in history when we haven't been a thank God you're here people. We've allowed religion and power and ego and leadership models and styles that are anti-Christ to actually be present in the way that we show up as ambassadors of Christ in the world. And as a result, we have very often been people that when we show up, people say, I wish you weren't here, rather than thank God you're here. And so I want to take a few minutes today to revisit this and ask, what would it look like if we were a thank God you're here again kind of people? And I want to do so by looking at a passage of scripture that I've never preached on before because I always thought it was a bit weird. So how about we do that today? Why not? Why not go out on a scripture that you've never preached on that's a bit weird and may leave everyone going, what on earth? Let's have a go. 2 Kings chapter 6. Let's read it. I'll read it. You can listen and look on the screen. Now the company of prophets said to Elisha, some translations say the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, as you see, the place where we live under your charge is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan and let us collect logs there, one for each of us, and build a place there for us to live. He answered, do so. I like that kind of leadership. Someone comes to you, they've got an idea, hey, let's build a building, and you just say, do so. That's pretty cool. Pretty releasing. Verse 3, then one of them said, please come with your servants. And he answered, I will. I love it. Just so concise. No mucking around, not big long questions and answers. It's just like, okay, let's do it. And so he went with them. And when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. Verse 5, but as one was felling a log, his axe head fell into the water. And he cried out, alas, master, it was borrowed. And then the man of God said, where did it fall? And when he showed him the place, he cut off a stick, he threw it in there and made the iron float. He said, pick it up. So he reached out his hand and took it. End of the story. Good story, right? What on earth? What is this about? What is going on in this passage? Elisha was a prophet, and he was a really interesting prophet because many of the miracles that he did were unusual and very ordinary. And on this occasion, we see the scenario in which Elisha, the prophet, does something that's quite surprising and interesting, and this story is recorded there for us to read and reflect on and to listen to and to consider what might God say to us as a community through this ministry of Elisha the prophet. And this is what I want to begin with talking about this morning, this idea of the ministry of showing up. The ministry of showing up. In other words, thank God you're here. In this passage, it begins by saying, now the company of prophets said to Elisha. Who are the company of prophets? Or in some translations, the sons of prophets. A couple of things I need to explain about this. Because it sounds like there's this group of prophets. They're like a team, like a club. And I'm wondering, how do you join? What do you have to do to get in? How do you become one of them? But the reality is, in Israel's history, there were periods of time where there would be almost like a school in which people were trained in the prophetic tradition. In this case, under Elisha as the lead prophet. And if you're thinking, that sounds exciting, and it kind of sounds like a Harry Potter type school where everyone rocks up and they go in and they're in a cool building and they're going to learn to do the magic tricks that the prophet has done. It's like, when do we get to do this? And when do we get to say really cool things? It's probably nothing like that. As a matter of fact, the prophet's role in their day wasn't really to do what we typically think of when we think of prophets, which is to predict the future. That was not their primary vocation. The primary vocation of the prophet was to declare and speak the word of God and to train, in this context, these younger prophets to learn what it means to call God's people back to being who God's people are called to be. To basically preserve and call God's people to God's covenant promises and to be faithful to the covenant arrangement that God had made with his people. And in this time, in this era, it was a dark time in Israel's history. The prophet's role is to remind the people who they are, is to remind the people who God is, and to actually be a living example of what it means to be faithful to the covenants of God. And so these prophets are often respected. Sometimes they're not respected. In Israel's history, sometimes the prophets were killed because they were the mouthpiece of God to speak and to challenge, sometimes speaking truth to power, other times calling God's promised people, the people of the covenant and the promise, to actually account for the fact that they were not being who God called them to be. And if you haven't worked this out yet, no one really likes being told what to do or being told when you're not doing it the right way. Correct? Like, I definitely don't like it. I don't like it from my wife. I don't like it from my daughter. I don't like it from my son. I don't like it from Greg Forrest. I don't like it for anyone. If anyone tells me, hey, you're not living the life you're meant to live, I'm just like, really? You know, like I can get defensive as the best of us could. So in this day, you have these prophets not always being liked by the people. So here we have this school or this company of prophets who are learning what it means to be a spokesperson for God, calling people back to God's purposes. Turns out their house is a bit too small where they're hanging out. So they need something else. And so they go down with this idea that they bring to Elisha, why don't we build some extra accommodation? And as they're building the accommodation, there's a mini tragedy that occurs. At least that's how we read it. But you've got to understand, in the 9th century BC, this is the Iron Age, and iron for the regular person was incredibly expensive. And so if you borrow an axe, it's because you can't afford one yourself. And if you borrow an axe and it's incredibly expensive, could be the equivalent to, some people have suggested, maybe 2 months' wages. You know, if you're living in this scenario as a student or as someone, as a trainee prophet, that you're not going to be able to afford to live. You're definitely not going to be able to afford to make this happen. And when you borrow in this culture, if you lose something that you have borrowed, there's a risk that not only you will experience the wrath of the person that you borrowed from and lost or broken what they gave you, but that you may end up having to become a debt slave to them. So when this situation happens, that this man is chopping at his log, and all of a sudden the axe head flies off the end of the axe and goes into the Jordan, for this man, it's a big deal. He's stressed, which is why he expresses the phrase, "Alas, Master, it was borrowed." The word alas basically is another way of saying, "Oh no." It's an old English kind of phrase. And when he does this, he's expressing deep concern about his reality and his situation. But notice what the man of God does. He doesn't judge him. He doesn't say, "You fool." He doesn't even ask him, "How did it happen?" And I was thinking about this because I was thinking about my parenting style. Sometimes when my kids do something, the way I deal with it is I ask them questions. Because someone told me it's better to ask questions than give advice. So I've gotten so good at asking questions to achieve the same result as giving advice. So I ask questions. So, when you did this, was there anything about what you did that you could have done differently to get a different result than the one we are currently in? Which is a way of saying, "You fool. Why did you do that? Now you've caused stress for me." But in this scenario, we see the total opposite. We don't see any judgment. We don't see any question asking. We don't see Elisha the prophet saying to this other prophet, hey, how did you mess this up? Do you understand what's at stake? You want to become a debt slave? You borrowed this? You got to look after it. What are you doing? There's none of that. What we see instead is the ministry of showing up at play, in which he asks the question, where did it fall? This is a question of compassion. This is a question of being seen, of being noticed, of care. And when the man showed him the place, Elisha does a strange thing that, as I researched this, no one had any good reasons for this other than sometimes these prophets did these interesting things. He cuts a stick, he throws it in. Some people say it's a symbolism, but he throws it in, and as the stick goes in the water where the axe head had fallen down, the axe head rises up to the surface, enabling the man to be able to grab the top of the axe head, and he's restored back to his situation of utter relief and the sense that things are going to be okay. It's very easy for us in this modern day world to focus in this story on the miracle and wonder, how did Elisha do that? And to actually miss the heart of the miracle. It's not about how did he do it. And I often wonder if Elisha was to get those prophets and they were to do a debrief later on in the day, and they were all sit down and they say, guys, what did you learn today? Whether they would be sitting there and they would say, well, I worked out that if you cut a certain size stick and you also pray a bit and you throw it in on a certain angle, there's this kind of metaphysical, spiritual kind of thing going on, and then you can get iron to rise up in water. And I just can't wait to try it. I don't think the conversation, if this was, in this imaginary conversation, going to be what it was about. I think you would have Elisha saying to them, what did you notice? What really happened today? And the conversation that would emerge would be a conversation that was related to listening, paying attention, considering the very real needs of someone who is right in front of us. Oh no, it was borrowed. Our calling as God's people is to be a thank God you're here people. This is our calling. You may remember in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus does his Sermon on the Mount, he says these words to the disciples. He says, you are the salt of the earth. And then he goes on and he says, you are the light of the world. A city that is seen, that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Let your light so shine. Let me say that again. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. A couple of interesting things about salt and light, and in particular in the era that Jesus was in. Salt primarily achieves three things back in Jesus' day. The first is it preserves. They didn't have refrigerating systems like what we have today. So if you had meat, you would use salt to preserve and to preserve the foods that you had. The second thing that salt does is it flavors. As Eugene Peterson translates in his Message version of this passage, he says, let the God flavors come out from you. And the third thing that salt does is it heals. Now, initially, when you put salt on a wound, it stings. But ultimately, it brings about healing. And this is part of what I think Jesus is getting at when he's reminding these disciples who are listening to him on this Sermon on the Mount. What's he doing? He's reminding them who they are. He's doing the prophet work. He's calling the people of Israel back to be who God has called them to be. Remember the original calling of Abraham on the people of God? The call of Abraham was, I will bless you and you will be a blessing to the nations. You are to be a light unto the nations. And so what Jesus is doing in this passage is he's speaking to his listeners and he's saying, you know what? You're so focused on being free from the Roman Empire. You're so focused on being free from every oppression around about you, and you're trying to use human means to get out of the scenarios that you find yourselves in. And what Jesus radically does is he shifts mindsets. And he says, in other passages, do not follow the systems and the customs of this world. Instead, he's always reminding them this is what God's way looks like. And on this occasion, he's now saying to them, if you want to know what God's kingdom looks like, it looks like us realizing that we're to be salt. And we're to be light. Light does three things I'm summarizing for this message. When we are God's light, this light reveals. It reveals the truth of situations and circumstances from a justice perspective. Light reveals the reality of how things actually are, both good and bad. I remember as a kid walking into a scary garage that we had at the back of a property we lived in. And I was always scared of it. It was like that scary part of the property. And we go down, they had this old wooden door, and I'd open the door up and I'd flick the switch on from a distance because you didn't want to walk in there because there were spider webs and all kinds of weird and strange things in there. Boogeymen. And once the light was in, you could walk in and go, what was I afraid of? You'd see a few cockroaches running around, some spider webs, but because you could see how it actually was, you could do something about it. And my dad would say to me sometimes, I want you to go in there, I want you to clean up the garage. We need light to be able to do what it is we're called to do. Light reveals. The second thing that light does is it guides. If we're going to be a people who are the light, we're going to guide others in the way of love. We're going to guide others in the way of truth, in the way of justice and mercy and compassion. We're going to guide others away from, as Peter says on the day of Pentecost, when all the people are saying, hey, what do we do? How do we respond to this message of the gospel? You know what Peter says? Save yourselves from this corrupt generation. He's guiding at this moment. And thirdly, light warms. Kind of stretching the metaphor a little bit here, but here's the idea. When we provide the light of God's love, we create a safe place for people to be. This is part of our calling. The ministry of showing up and becoming a thank God you're here again people is about presence. It's about having presence in our community. And what our presence says is you're not alone in this struggle. Your problems matter to God. Help is available. Restoration is possible. And this community cares about you. This is the Elisha model. This is the Elisha way. The Elisha model works like this. We listen for the, alas, it was borrowed moments. Do you know, when I was 21 years of age, I'd had my birthday party, and for my 21st, I got a suit. And not long after that, I joined the team of a church that was a new church plant. And we were having a service in an auditorium, not much different to this. It was a school hall. And I'd brought my jacket. This was back in the era, in wintertime at least, but back in the era where you sort of dressed up a tiny bit more to church. So I was wearing a suit jacket. It's kind of the expectation, and it was kind of cool. And so I had my 21st suit there. It happened to be a very light, kind of creamy coloured, I don't even know what the colour is, but it was a very light coloured jacket. I think Don Johnson. I just revealed how old I am. Anyway, and so I had my jacket and I left it over the back of a seat at the end of the service. And someone in the community decided it was a good idea to put their cup of coffee on the seat while they went off to do something else where my jacket was hanging. And then I didn't know this. I come behind the seat and grab my jacket and flick it up, and the cup of coffee fell over and splashes and coffee goes all over the jacket. And in that moment, I had alas, my jacket, my 21st present, It was this moment of, oh, you're kidding me. And I looked at it and I remember thinking, I have no clue what to do about this scenario other than I got to soak it somehow. And right out of the corner of my eye, I see someone coming across to me. And it happened to be the pastor of the church that I just joined the team. And he came over and he said, I just saw what happened. He said, give me your jacket. He said, come with me. And he took my jacket. He finished the conversations that he was having. He said, I'm sorry, I just got to do something. And he went into this kitchen and he spent the next 20 minutes washing out the coffee out of my jacket. Such a small thing. But for me in that moment, it was a significant thing. There was a moment in which he listened for the alas, it was borrowed, except it wasn't borrowed, it was a gift kind of moment. And the second part of the Elisha model is this: show me where it fell. And the inference is, let me help. Show me where it fell. So he begins to wash it out, and he gets nearly all the stain out of the jacket, and I managed to be able to get someone else to help do it. Do you know that one act stuck in my head to this day? It's the little things, the little miracle moments that is actually in the spirit of the prophets and through Jesus that we're called to engage in. That story reminded me then of another pastor that I had when I was a teenager. And we had a church that was out in the western suburbs of Sydney. And there was a man by the name of Adrian who used to come and visit our church. And he was a street person. He lived on the streets. And every now and again, he would have a shower in the toilets that we had on the property and the bathrooms. But he would rock up to the service, and when he walked in, you'd be worshiping God, and you knew he walked in. The smell that came off his body from having not washed in perhaps months was really challenging to deal with. And every single time he turned up to the church, he would walk down at the end of the sermon and he would stand at the front of the church to give his life to Jesus again. He did it every single time. And my pastor, without fail, every time, walked up to him and threw his arms around him and hugged him for minutes. And I never forget the day my dad leaned over to me and said, if you want to be a pastor, that's how you do it. This is the ministry of Elisha. This is the ministry of showing up. Those examples inspired me to think, what does it look like for me to be a thank God you're here kind of person? Recently, and I hesitate to share this, but I want to share this as a humbling moment. My wife went somewhere where she bumped into someone, and this person went up to Teresa and said, they were chatting away, and he said, I just want you to know that your husband saved my life. She was like, oh my goodness, tell me about that. And so he began to tell her. And then she came home and she said, guess what? I met this guy and he said, you saved his life. And as I heard that, I thought to myself, oh my goodness. I remember the day that I met him and there was a choice and a moment of hesitation where I thought, I don't have time to deal with this situation at the moment. And I felt like God said in my head, what kind of a pastor are you going to be? So I sat down with this person and did nothing but listen as he said, alas, my axe head has fallen, the one I borrowed. And though he didn't say those exact words, his story was one of desperation. And I didn't realize that the small part that I would play in that, from his perspective, would have a far greater. And my encouragement to you is, I am not some special person. I am an ordinary, everyday person who is learning the Elisha way, the Jesus way, of what it means to be salt and to be light. And my encouragement to you is, if we're going to be a missionary people, let's be the kind of missionary people that don't rock up with our big headlights and put on the high beams and actually cause people to want to steer away, but actually our light is a blessing and a gift, and our conversations and our ability to show up and to be present and to meet the most basic needs is a symbol of the love that God has poured into our hearts. And so my encouragement to you is quite simply this. As I started with my first message here in this community, even though I'll share some reflections in a couple of weeks' time, my parting words is that I implore you, be the kind of person, be the kind of community, be the church that people say, thank God you're here. Can we stand to our feet?